Claire Dawson came to the mountains believing snow could bury grief. She chose silence, isolation, and the cold, anything to escape the memory of the child she lost. But on one blizzard night, the snow didn't hide her pain. It delivered someone else's. A bound man, a wounded German shepherd, and a choice that would pull her back into a world she was trying to disappear from. If this already pulls you in, like, share, and subscribe, because this story is just beginning. Snow fell without urgency. The wind moved slowly through the trees. A single cabin stood among the pines, its windows dim, its silence deep enough to hear memory breathe. Claire Dawson came to the mountains believing snow could bury grief. She was 30 years old, slender, pale from months without sun, her brown hair falling loosely to her shoulders as if she no longer bothered to decide how it should be. She wore the same ash-gray winter jacket every day, worn at the cuffs, heavy with quiet use. Inside the cabin, there was one chair, a small wooden table, and a calendar frozen in a month she could not bring herself to turn. She had not come to rest. She had come to disappear. The accident that took her child had ended quickly, but grief did not. It lingered in her chest, in the way she avoided mirrors, in the habit of holding her breath when rooms felt too quiet. She lived simply, eating little, sleeping lightly, listening to the sound of wind against wood, as if it were a voice that understood restraint. On that night, the storm worsened. When the weather station near the ridge went silent, Claire pulled on her boots and stepped outside, moving out of habit rather than purpose. Caring for her father during his long illness had taught her to respond when something failed, even when no one was watching. Some instincts, she had learned, do not disappear just because the person they were formed for is gone. She saw them near the tree line, half covered by snow. A man and a dog. The man lay on his side, bound, unmoving, his dark coat torn, his face marked by cold and exhaustion. He looked to be in his mid-30s, tall, broad-shouldered, even in stillness, with a short beard dusted white by snow. His breathing was shallow but present. The dog was a German shepherd, large and muscular, black and tan fur matted with ice. He was injured, favoring one side, but even then his body was angled toward the man, as if shielding him from the world. There was a note pinned to a nearby tree, its words brief and deliberate, written to be found. Claire read it once and did not read it again. She stood there longer than she should have, the storm biting at her face, weighing the simple choice of turning back. She could have closed the door. She could have returned to the safety of being alone, but the dog lifted his head when he sensed her, his eyes dark and steady, not pleading, not threatening, just present. Something in that look reminded her of a promise she had once made and never fulfilled. She knelt, her hands shaking, and began to pull them both toward the cabin. Inside, the warmth came slowly. Claire moved with care, guided by memory more than confidence. She had spent years tending to her father's failing body, learning how to warm skin, how to speak without waking pain, how to wait. She worked first on the dog, wrapping his wounded flank, speaking softly, her voice low and unhurried. At first, the shepherd did not let her near the man. His body tensed, his breath heavy, his loyalty unbroken even in injury. Claire did not force the moment. She sat back on the floor, letting silence do what urgency could not. She spoke to the dog as if he were listening, not with ears, but with something older. When she reached out again, slowly, he allowed it. Then, without command or signal, he rested his head against her leg. The choice was his. The man stirred later, opening his eyes briefly. His voice, rough and restrained, carried the weight of long nights and longer truths. His name was Evan Cole. He said little more. He did not thank her. He did not explain. Claire did not ask. Outside, the storm pressed on, but inside the cabin, the air shifted, as if something long closed had been opened just enough to let breath return. By the time dawn hinted at the edge of the sky, Claire sat awake beside the fire, the dog sleeping near her feet, Evan resting on the floor wrapped in blankets. The cabin no longer felt empty. It felt altered. She did not know what would come next, and for the first time in months, that uncertainty did not frighten her. It felt like a beginning she had not planned. She placed another log on the fire and waited, not for answers, but for the simple act of staying. In the quiet, she allowed herself a thought she had not spoken aloud since the accident, that maybe being left behind was not the same as being finished. Outside, the snow continued to fall, gentle now, covering the ground without erasing what lay beneath. The fire took its time. Wood cracked softly. Outside, the storm pressed against the walls as if testing whether the cabin still remembered how to stand. Claire pulled them inside one careful movement at a time, her breath shallow, her hands steady in a way that surprised even her. The cabin smelled of old pine, smoke, and damp wool. She had learned long ago how to move when a body was failing. Her father's illness had been slow, patient in its cruelty, and it had taught her the quiet skills no one applauds. How to warm cold skin, how to stop bleeding with what is near, how to wait without panic. She knelt beside the German shepherd first. Kaiser was large, older than a young dog, his black and tan fur thick and heavy with melting snow. One hind leg trembled when she touched it. His eyes stayed fixed on the man on the floor. Claire spoke softly, not in commands, but in the same low voice she had once used in hospital rooms at night. She wrapped the dog's flank, layer by layer, slow enough that he could follow every movement. Only then did she turn her attention to the man. Evan Cole lay still, tall even in collapse, dark hair damp with sweat, a short beard marking a face shaped by long endurance. His breathing was uneven, but present. Claire did not hurry. She had learned that life sometimes needs permission more than speed. Kaiser did not let her near Evan at first. His body stiffened, a low sound moving in his chest, not anger, but warning. Claire sat back on the wooden floor, the cold seeping through her jeans. She waited. The fire filled the space between them. She spoke again, this time of nothing useful, of storms that pass, of hands that stay, of a child who once slept with her head against Claire's heart. She did not say the child's name. She never did. The dog watched her with an old measuring gaze. Then, slowly, as if the decision cost him something, Kaiser lowered his head and rested it against her leg. The weight was solid. Trust, when it comes, often arrives without ceremony. Claire felt it like a quiet acceptance, not earned, but granted. She moved then, tending to Evan, cleaning his wounds, wrapping him in blankets. When Evan stirred, his eyes opened only briefly. His voice, rough and restrained, carried the sound of a man who had learned not to ask for help. "You didn't have to," he said. Claire answered without looking at him, "I know." Outside, the wind shifted, and for a moment the cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a crossing. The knock came as a surprise, sharp against the storm. Claire's body tensed, but Kaiser lifted his head and listened, his ears alert, his breath steady. Claire opened the door to find a woman standing in the snow, mid-30s, athletic, her ranger jacket dark green and dusted white. Rachel Monroe spoke with the calm of someone used to weather being worse than people. Her voice was clear, practical, shaped by years outdoors. She explained she had been checking the weather station when the signal went dark. She stepped inside without invitation, taking in the scene with trained eyes. Rachel moved to Kaiser immediately, kneeling beside him, her hands skilled and unshowy as she examined the wound. She carried a compact pack, worn and efficient, the kind used by someone who does not expect rescue. As she stitched the dog's flank, she spoke quietly, almost to herself, about tire tracks seen at night, about trucks moving where no road should matter. She said the reports went nowhere. Her eyes, steady and tired, lifted to meet Claire's. "This isn't an accident," she said, not as a warning, but as a fact. Evan listened from the floor, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, the lines of conflict visible even in rest. Something unspoken passed between the three of them. The storm outside did not lessen, but inside the shape of the night changed. Later, when the fire had settled and the worst of the wind moved on, the cabin grew quiet again. Kaiser slept near the hearth, his breathing deep and even. Rachel stepped back into the snow, promising to return at first light. Evan rested, his face turned toward the warmth, the weight of survival still unfamiliar. Claire sat alone at the table, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug she had not used in months. The chair across from her was no longer empty. She thought of how easily she could have closed the door earlier that night, how close she had come to choosing absence over presence. Instead, she stayed, not because she was brave, because she was tired of leaving. She placed another log on the fire and listened to the sound it made when it caught. In that sound, she felt something she had not allowed herself in a long time. Not hope exactly, but the beginning of permission to believe that staying might be its own kind of salvation. Morning arrived without color. Light seeped through frost-clouded glass. The cabin smelled of wet wood and smoke, and of something newly awake. Evan came back to himself slowly, as men do when the body decides before the mind. His eyes opened, then closed again, measuring pain. He was in his mid-30s, tall, built for work rather than rest, his dark hair matted, his short beard uneven where ice had pulled at it. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and practiced, the sound of a man who learned long ago not to waste words. He said his name. He said he had been following a line most people pretended not to see, trucks moving at night through public land, paperwork that always arrived complete, and people who asked questions being transferred elsewhere. He had worked alone, because alone leaves fewer fingerprints. The phone that carried everything, dates, routes, names, was gone. He believed there was a hand inside the department that kept the gates open and the lights off. As he spoke, Claire watched his eyes, steady but tired, the look of someone who knows truth does not make you safe. She listened the way she had listened to doctors years ago, absorbing what was said and what was not. Kaiser lay near the hearth, his head on his paws, ears shifting toward Evan's voice. The fire breathed. Outside, the wind eased, as if the mountain itself were pausing to hear. They did not rush. Truth, Claire had learned, arrives better when you let it. When Evan slept again, Kaiser rose with effort, favoring his leg, and went to the door. The German shepherd was older than he looked, his black and tan coat thick and dulled by years of weather, his eyes clear with purpose. He waited until Claire stood, then stepped into the snow, nose low, following a line the storm had not erased. Claire followed at a distance, her boots sinking, the cold, waking memories she did not invite. The trail bent toward the trees where she had first found them. Kaiser moved with care, stopping where the snow had been disturbed. Beneath it lay small truths, a shell casing cold as bone, a strip of industrial tape stiff with frost, a device wrapped hurriedly and pressed into the ground as if shame could hide it. These were not the marks of accident or panic. They were tidy, professional. Claire felt the old tightness in her chest return, the knowledge that order can be cruel when it is used to disappear people. Kaiser stood watch while she gathered what she could. He did not look at the objects. He looked back toward the cabin, where Evan slept, as if measuring the distance between what had been and what still needed guarding. Rachel returned before noon, her ranger jacket dark against the white, her steps economical. She listened, asked little, and when she spoke, it was to place what they found into a map she had been carrying for years in her head. Names surfaced without enthusiasm. One of them was Thomas Blackwood. Evan said it without emphasis, as if speaking it too loudly would give it more power. Blackwood was older, high enough to sign and be believed, calm enough to let others do the messy work. A man like that, Evan said, does not chase. He waits. Rachel's mouth tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. She had filed reports that never moved, requests that returned stamped and empty. The system, she said, had learned how to keep its hands clean. Claire watched the two of them, saw how experience bent them differently. Evan inward, Rachel steady and outward, both carrying the same weight. Kaiser rested his chin on Claire's boot, the contact grounding her. She understood then that this was not about catching someone. It was about deciding whether the truth deserved air. She thought of the calendar she had not turned, the chair she had not filled. If she left now, the night would close over these things, and they would be gone, neat as snow. By afternoon, the light shifted, and the cabin held a quiet that felt earned. Evan woke again, clearer now, and thanked Claire with his eyes rather than his mouth. She accepted it without ceremony. She was not here to be named. She was here because staying had begun to feel like a vow. Rachel packed her things, promising to return with daylight and discretion. Kaiser lay back down, his breathing slow, his trust unguarded. Claire stood at the window and watched the mountain settle into itself. She did not imagine justice arriving quickly or cleanly. She imagined only this, that some truths need witnesses more than weapons, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is refuse to vanish. She turned the calendar to the present month and placed it back on the wall. The fire dimmed, then steadied. In the soft crackle, she made a quiet promise to stay long enough for what had been found to matter, and to let what came next find her here. Night returned with a different weight. Snow had stopped falling, but the dark felt attentive, as if the mountain were holding its breath and waiting for a sound to betray the living. The warning came without noise. Kaiser lifted his head and froze, every muscle drawn tight beneath his thick black and tan coat. He was an older German shepherd, heavy in the chest, the gray at his muzzle easy to miss unless you knew to look. His eyes fixed on the back door, not with fear, but with certainty. Claire followed his gaze and felt the hair on her arms rise. The air carried a smell that did not belong, metal and oil, sharp and patient. Evan moved slowly despite the pain, his tall frame careful not to argue with injury. He knelt and saw what Kaiser had already known. A thin wire drawn low, a small device buried beneath snow and shadow. A trap set to be found by those who fled. Evan's voice was steady, shaped by years of choosing calm when panic would have been easier. "They're close," he said, not as alarm, but as acknowledgement. Claire thought of how silence can learn to speak when you stop ignoring it. The cabin's wood creaked as the heat shifted. Somewhere beyond the trees, boots pressed snow into something deliberate. Kaiser did not growl. He watched. The quiet was no longer empty. It had intent. Evan turned to Claire then, his beard catching the low light, his eyes older than his years. He spoke as someone who had already paid for staying. "You should go, now. There's still time." The words were practical, not unkind. Claire heard them and felt the old instinct rise, the one that had taken her up the mountain in the first place. Leave before it hurts again. She looked at the single chair, the turned calendar, the dog at her side who had chosen her without knowing her name. Her voice did not shake. "If I go," she said, "I will have to keep running for the rest of my life." Evan studied her, the conflict plain in his eyes. He nodded once, the way men do when an argument has ended. The night broke open with movement then. Figures came from the trees, measured and quiet. A shot cracked the air, sharp as splintered wood. Claire pressed herself into the wall, the smell of smoke and pine filling her lungs. Kaiser moved before command, his body a dark line through the room, warning with presence rather than sound. In the confusion, one man stumbled, young, lean, his jacket too light for the cold, his breath coming hard. Evan closed the distance with restraint, not rage. When it was done, the man sat shaking, wrists bound, eyes wide with the shock of still being alive. They brought him inside. He was no more than 25, his face unlined, his hands scarred by work that paid poorly and asked much. He spoke with a thin voice, the accent of nearby towns, the sound of someone who had believed the forest would keep secrets for him. He said he had been hired, not told names. He said he did not know the plan, only the payment. Evan listened without interrupting, his gaze level, his breathing even. When Evan spoke a single name, Thomas Blackwood, the young man's shoulders collapsed as if the word had weight. He nodded. He did not add detail. He did not need to. Outside, the wind found the eaves again, tapping lightly, almost apologetic. Claire watched the exchange and felt something loosen inside her. The world she had been hiding from had followed her anyway, not to punish, but to ask something of her. Rachel returned near dawn, her ranger jacket dark, her eyes sharp with purpose. She took in the room and said little, the way professionals do when the facts are already loud enough. This was not only pursuit, Claire understood. It was the long work of refusing to look away. When the house settled again, the prisoner asleep under watch, the fire burned low and honest. Kaiser lay with his head on Claire's foot, the steady rhythm of his breathing anchoring the room. Evan sat across from her, exhaustion visible now that danger had receded. No one spoke for a while. Silence had said enough. Claire broke it gently. "We tell the truth," she said, not as strategy, but as belief. Evan met her eyes and answered with the smallest smile she had seen from him. Outside, the first light touched the snow and made it plain rather than beautiful. Claire felt no urge to leave. She felt the opposite, a quiet commitment forming where fear had lived. Some nights, she knew, would still be hard, but this one had taught her something she could carry. Silence warns before it condemns. And when it does, listening can be an act of mercy. She stood and added a log to the fire, the flame catching with a soft, willing sound, and made a promise that asked for no witness but herself, to stay present long enough for the truth to breathe. Dawn came thin and pale. Snow softened the canyon walls. Sound traveled slowly there, as if the earth preferred listening to speaking. They chose the canyon because it narrowed truth into a single path. Rachel arrived before first light, calm and exact, her ranger jacket zipped to the throat, breath steady in the cold. With her came federal agents who moved without noise, men and women shaped by patience rather than urgency. No speeches were made. Plans were drawn with fingers in the snow, erased and drawn again. Evan stood a little apart, tall and quiet, his beard catching frost, the ache in his body a reminder of how close he had come to disappearing. Claire watched him and understood something new about courage. It is not loud. It stands and waits. Kaiser lay beside her, the big German shepherd breathing slow, his wound bound cleanly, his eyes clear. He was not healed, not fully, but he was present. Claire rested her hand against the thick fur at his neck and felt the steady heat of life. She thought of the nights she had waited beside a hospital bed, counting breaths, believing presence could matter even when outcomes could not be controlled. The canyon held them in a shared hush. Radios whispered. The sky lifted. Somewhere down the narrow road, engines murmured, then cut. The mountain seemed to lean closer, attentive to what would be asked of it. The trucks arrived as promised. Doors opened. Men stepped out with practiced ease, coats too light for mercy. And then the children, small figures in oversized jackets, eyes wide, hands clutched together for warmth and certainty. The sight struck Claire like a held breath released all at once. She did not look away. She had learned what looking away costs. Thomas Blackwood appeared last. He was older than Claire had imagined, silver at the temples, posture easy, voice low and confident, a man accustomed to being believed. When he spoke, others listened. He reached for one of the children, a boy no more than 10, and drew him close with a hand that did not tremble. The canyon fell into a deeper silence. No shots, no shouting. Even the wind paused. Evan felt the familiar pull of impatience and forced it down. He remembered his father's voice, long ago, telling him that restraint can be a kind of strength. Claire's heart moved fast, then steadied. She saw not the gun, but the child's breath, the small cloud it made in the cold. She thought of her own loss and refused to let it speak for her now. The agents waited. Time stretched into a single, delicate thread. Snow burst upward without warning. Kaiser ran. Not wildly, not in anger. He moved as if the choice had already been made. His body, powerful and sure, despite pain, cut the distance in silence. He struck Blackwood at the hip, shoulder to thigh, clean and decisive. The man staggered. The child fell backward into waiting arms. In the same heartbeat, Evan moved. He did not shout. He closed, controlled, and took Blackwood down with a force born of restraint, finally released. Metal clattered. Orders came then, sharp and brief. The agent stepped in, cuffs finding wrists, voices finding names. The children were gathered, wrapped, counted. Some cried, some stared. One looked back at Kaiser, who stood a few paces away, chest rising, eyes steady, as if measuring whether his work was finished. Claire reached him and knelt, pressing her forehead to his, whispering nothing that needed words. Evan stood nearby, breathing hard, his eyes wet and unashamed. Blackwood was led away, smaller now, the confidence gone, replaced by a hollow quiet that did not ask forgiveness and did not deserve it. The canyon exhaled. Snow settled. Truth had room to stand. Later, when the sun climbed and softened the edges of everything, they gathered at the rim. The agents departed with the children, with care, with promises that sounded like plans instead of apologies. Rachel lingered, her eyes bright, already thinking of the work ahead, the slow repair of trust, the long tending of land and people. Evan leaned against a rock, his strength returning in pieces, the cost of staying finally worth paying. Claire watched the light move across the snow and felt something inside her loosen and mend at once. She had not undone her loss. She had not erased the past. But she had chosen not to let silence finish the job grief had begun. Kaiser sat between her and Evan, a small medal now resting against his fur, the simple weight of recognition. Claire scratched behind his ears, and he closed his eyes, satisfied. The mountain did not applaud. It never does. It simply kept standing. Claire made a quiet promise she did not speak aloud, to keep showing up, to keep choosing presence, to let mercy be louder than fear. The day went on, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. If this story reached you, it's because you're still here. Loneliness, illness, and quiet days can make life feel smaller, but your presence still matters more than you know. Like Claire, staying one more day, one more breath, can be an act of courage. If you feel alone, share this story. Leave a comment so we know you're with us. Subscribe for more stories of hope. May God bless you, protect your health, and remind you that you are not forgotten.